At this very moment, as you listen to these words, Iranian engineers are working through the rubble of Natanz, not rebuilding, accelerating, and the world that existed before June 2025 no longer exists. This is not speculation. This is what the data says. The title of this video mentions a 15-minute warning, but 15 minutes is the generous number. The real number is 12. 12 minutes. That is the flight time of a hypersonic missile launched from Iranian territory and reaching Tel Aviv at Mach 5. 12 minutes to detect, verify, decide, authorize, and launch a response. 12 minutes to execute a chain that, during the Cold War, was designed to run in 30. And the problem here has stopped being political. It has become a matter of physics. And in 2025, 3 independent events, in 3 countries, taken by 3 different leaders, for 3 distinct reasons, collapsed the mathematics upon which the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence was built. Israel, Iran, Russia. 3 decisions. 1 framework destroyed. In this video, you will understand exactly what changed, why it changed now, and why there is still no framework capable of replacing what was broken. Nuclear deterrence has always operated on a central premise: sufficient time. Time to detect the launch. Time to verify it was not a false alarm. Time to consult commanders. Time for the political leader to authorize a response. Time for the missiles to leave their silos and reach their target in a second strike retaliation that made the first strike irrational for any adversary. During the Cold War, with weaponry based on strategic bombers, that time existed in abundance. A Soviet Tu-95 bomber took hours to cross the Atlantic and reach American territory. Hours to detect on radar, hours to confirm the threat, hours to deliberate, hours to decide. Deterrence functioned almost comfortably because warning time created space for human judgment to operate. Then came the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and time shrank from hours to 30 minutes. 30 minutes seemed impossible to manage when the first Soviet silos became operational. American military planners argued there was not enough time for anything resembling rational deliberation. The world adapted, at immense cost and with solutions that created their own risks. NORAD was built specifically to manage the detection and tracking of ICBMs on a global scale. The direct line between Moscow and Washington, the red telephone, was established to reduce the risk of escalation through miscommunication. The launch on warning doctrine was adopted because, with 30 minutes, the only way to guarantee second strike capability was to authorize an immediate launch upon confirmation of an incoming attack, without waiting for the first blow to land. But 30 minutes was enough. Narrowly, at great cost, with near catastrophes we will analyze, but enough to keep the logical cycle of deterrence functioning. Now, the warning is 12 minutes, and no framework was built for that. The 2025 American military assessment was explicit, not vague, not diplomatically ambiguous, explicit. Hypersonic weapons severely challenge detection and response windows. Severely is official military report language, translated into plain language. The response system that exists cannot execute its minimum steps within the available time window when the delivery vehicle is hypersonic. Let me break down what this means in practice, step by step. The detection to response chain has sequential steps, each with a minimum time cost that is non-negotiable. Detection. Sensors identify the launch. Verification. Multiple independent sources must confirm before any action, because a single system alarm is not sufficient, and we will return to 1983 to explain why. Decision and authorization. The political leader must be located, briefed, and execute the formal authorization through secure communications with their own protocol overheads. Launch of the response. Add up the minimum time for each step under optimal operational conditions, not crisis conditions with noise and pressure, under optimal conditions. The result is a number that exceeds 12 minutes. That is the mathematics that broke. And what changed in 2025 to make this not merely theoretical, but operational and immediate, began with an Israeli decision that no one expected would come paired with a doctrinal shift. For 50 years, Israel maintained a policy that non-proliferation experts call nuclear ambiguity. The official position of the State of Israel, repeated in every diplomatic context, at every hearing, by every prime minister since Golda Meir, was that Israel would not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Not a confirmation, not a denial. A carefully calibrated response that confirmed neither and denied neither. The widely accepted estimate in Western intelligence is that Israel developed nuclear capability in the 1960s and possesses between 80 and 400 warheads. But Israel never confirmed it, and that plausible deniability was in itself an extraordinarily effective deterrence tool. The logic was elegant in its economy. Any adversary considering an attack on Israel had to calculate against a threat that had never been confirmed, but could not be dismissed with certainty either. The ambiguity maximized the perceived cost of attack without requiring Israel to publicly commit to a posture that adversaries would be compelled to respond to, such as developing their own programs to balance the threat. The ambiguity kept fear useful without creating the arms race that an explicit declaration might have triggered. For 50 years, it worked as cheap, effective, and non-provocative deterrence. In June 2025, Israel conducted a 12-day military operation against Iranian nuclear and missile facilities. The operation was neither discreet nor easily deniable. It was systematic, coordinated across multiple waves of attack, and publicly acknowledged by the Israel Defense Forces. Natanz was struck. Missile development facilities were destroyed or severely damaged. The IDF not only did not deny it, they communicated the operation's strategic objectives in real time. During that operation, the Iranians employed the Fateh K-Bar series, the hypersonic missiles with a stated speed of Mach 15, not in controlled tests, in real combat conditions. The series was operationally tested in June 2025, which means there is now a combat deployment record for these systems. These are not theoretical capabilities. They are demonstrated capabilities. But the most consequential aspect of the June operation was not what was physically destroyed. It was what Israel said and signaled while it was destroying. By conducting explicit and explicitly acknowledged strikes against the Iranian nuclear program, Israel broke decades of nuclear ambiguity. Not with a formal press conference declaration. No prime minister announced, "We confirm our nuclear warheads." The rupture was more subtle and more definitive. Israel demonstrated through action that it was willing to use direct military force to prevent Iranian nuclear proliferation. That only makes strategic sense if Israel has something to protect that Iranian nuclear development directly threatens. Ambiguity, in practice, becomes untenable when you act as though the threat is existential. What emerged in its place is what arms control analysts call selective nuclear disclosure. Israel did not formally confirm possession of warheads. But the messages conveyed by the strikes, combined with carefully calibrated statements from Israeli leaders in the post-operation period, signaled to regional adversaries and Western allies that Israel considers its nuclear capability an explicit part of its strategic calculus. This shift matters for a specific reason that goes beyond the symbolic. It redefined the rules of the game in the Middle East in a way that every other actor must respond to. Nuclear ambiguity had maintained a peculiar stability precisely because it did not force responses. A more explicit posture creates pressure on other regional actors to recalibrate, including the actor that was attacked. And the IAEA, on March 3, 2026, confirmed the following. Natanz remains inaccessible for international inspections. The facilities were damaged by the strikes, but Iran, in the meantime, is repairing its missile facilities, its delivery vectors, at a significantly faster pace than it is repairing the nuclear infrastructure that was the declared target of the Israeli operation. That choice goes far beyond logistics. It is a statement of strategic priority. And to understand what that priority reveals, you need to understand what Iran had before June 2025 and what it decided to have afterward. Before June 2025, the Iranian nuclear program was in a specific and technically significant state. Enrichment capability without active political authorization for weaponization. Iran possessed 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. To contextualize that number, the weapons-grade threshold is 90% enrichment, but the final enrichment stages, from 60% to 90%, are technically simpler than the early stages, from natural uranium to 20% and from 20% to 60%. Most of the hard work was already done. The estimate from non-proliferation analysts is that Iran could achieve weapons-grade material within a matter of weeks from the state in which the program stood. But there was a line Iran had not crossed, and that was strategically significant: formal authorization to develop miniaturized warheads. The leap from enriched fissile material to a functional deployable nuclear weapon requires miniaturization, engineering a warhead small, light, and structurally robust enough to be carried by a ballistic or hypersonic missile and survive the launch, trajectory, and re-entry environment. That step is far from trivial. It requires specific engineering design, testing capability, and a clear political decision to move forward with active weaponization. Before the Israeli strikes of June, Khamenei had not given that authorization. In October 2025, 4 months after the strikes, Iran's supreme leader formally authorized the development of miniaturized nuclear warheads. The distinction between before and after October 2025 is critical to understanding what the Israeli strikes actually produced as a strategic result. Before October, Iran had the technical capability, had the material, but it did not have the political decision to cross from enrichment to weapons manufacturing. That margin, between having the material and having the weapon, was the window where diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and non-proliferation instruments could, in theory, act to reverse or freeze the program without direct armed confrontation. The October 2025 authorization closed that window. The argument that non-proliferation analysts are sustaining, and that the Iranian government itself has been signaling implicitly through statements from second-tier officials, is that the Israeli offensive accelerated the Iranian decision toward weaponization, not prevented it. The Iranian logic follows a strategic sequence with clear historical precedents. If you can be attacked militarily with impunity while lacking nuclear weapons, the conclusion rational leaders in an international self-help system reach is that acquiring nuclear weapons is necessary to deter future attacks. North Korea reached that conclusion in the 2000s and accelerated its program in response to American pressure. Libya reached the opposite conclusion under Gaddafi. It disarmed in 2003 under Western guarantees and was toppled in 2011. For the Iranian regime, June 2025 was an empirical demonstration that the status quo of capability without weapons did not provide sufficient protection against direct military action. And the Iranian operational response reinforces that reading. The repair and reconstruction priority following the strikes was clearly directed toward missile facilities, the delivery vectors, and not toward the Natanz nuclear infrastructure that was the operation's declared target. Repairing Natanz under IAEA scrutiny is geopolitically complicated. Repairing missile facilities is less visible and more immediately relevant to what the regime will need. The Fateh Khaybar series, which was combat tested in June 2025, represents precisely that delivery vector priority. Mach 15 is the claimed speed, a claim Western experts treat with technical skepticism, given that sustained hypersonic speeds at the upper limit still present materials engineering challenges that few countries have mastered. But even assuming speeds in the Mach 5 to Mach 8 range, the systems already demonstrate the characteristics that make detection and interception difficult: non-ballistic atmospheric trajectory, variable altitude, terminal phase maneuvering. The operation may have bought weeks on the timeline of the Iranian nuclear program. The October 2025 authorization repositioned where Iran stands on the weaponization trajectory in a way that the time gained by the strikes failed to compensate for. And while all of this was unfolding in the Middle East, a third actor had quietly pulled the rug out from under the entire global arms control framework, a full year before any of these events. Israel and Iran dominate the headlines. But the third actor in this transformation is what converts a regional crisis into a global systemic shift. And the third actor moved first. In 2024, before the Israeli strikes, before Khamenei's authorization, Russia formally altered its nuclear doctrine. It was the first formal lowering of the nuclear use threshold by a recognized power since the Cold War. the doctrine was rewritten to explicitly include hypersonics crossing state borders as a condition that could justify a Russian nuclear response. This matters on two levels. On the technical strategic level, by including hypersonics as a potential trigger, Russia is arguing that the compression of warning time is itself a qualitative act of escalation. A missile that reduces warning from 30 minutes to 12 is not merely faster under Russian doctrine. It is a categorically different threat that justifies a categorically different response. On the level of geopolitical precedent, when a permanent nuclear power on the UN Security Council formally lowers its nuclear threshold, it is normalizing the idea that thresholds are adjustable variables. This provides language and precedent for other states, and the Iranian regime is watching. In August 2025, Putin deployed hypersonic missiles in Belarus. The positioning was not random. The coverage zones specifically encompassed targets in Eastern and Central Europe, capitals of NATO countries, allied military installations, critical infrastructure. Far from being a defensive second strike posture, this is a demonstrative reach positioning that communicates both capability and willingness to employ. In November 2025, Russia initiated work on next-generation cruise missiles with nuclear propulsion, designed to reach speeds of Mach 3 or higher. These systems are distinct from hypersonics in the strict technical sense. Mach 5 is the conventional threshold for the hypersonic category, but they represent the development trajectory that connects existing capabilities to future ones. Nuclear propulsion in cruise missiles resolves one of the fundamental range and endurance problems that limits conventional hypersonic systems. And in 2026, the Yasin-M submarine PERM enters operational service. The PERM is a delivery platform for the Zircon, the Russian hypersonic cruise missile with confirmed nuclear capability. A submarine can position itself in any oceanic quadrant without the kind of advance warning that a land-based facility gives to intelligence satellites. The 12-minute warning we discussed assumes you know, with some degree of advance notice, where the missile will be launched from and in what general direction. With an untracked Yasin-M in position, you may not have that information. The connection between Russian movements and the Iranian problem is not one of direct coordination. There is no evidence that Moscow and Tehran are operating as a coordinated alliance in this specific domain. But Russia provides something more durable and harder to counter than an alliance, a template and a set of precedents. An empirical demonstration that nuclear powers can lower their doctrinal thresholds, position advanced systems close to adversaries, and do so without the international arms control architecture immediately imploding. The Iranian regime, which is watching the global response to Russian moves with close attention, is drawing lessons. Now let's step away from geopolitics and talk about what lies beneath all of this. The deeper question is not who was right and who was wrong. It's whether the deterrence system as it was built can still function mathematically when one of its fundamental variables has changed value. The detection-to-response chain has sequential steps. Each step has a minimum execution time. These minimum times are non-negotiable because they derive from physical constants, hardware limitations, and human cognitive latencies that training does not eliminate, only marginally reduces. Add up each of these steps, even in the most favorable scenarios. The result will inevitably exceed the 12-minute mark. We are not talking about a political opinion or an argumentative bias. This is the direct result of summing the process steps with the minimum times each one requires. The 2025 American Military Assessment reached the same conclusion using different language. It severely challenges detection and response windows. Now, the Arrow 4, the interceptor system jointly developed by Israel and the United States, is entering live testing in mid-2026. What the Arrow 4 promises is technically impressive. Hypersonic missile interception at multiple trajectory phases using advanced sensors, high-resolution tracking radar, and high-speed kinetics in the interceptor. If it works as promised, it provides a defensive answer to the 12-minute problem that bypasses the offensive detection-to-response chain. Instead of responding with a counterstrike within 12 minutes, you shoot the missile down before it arrives. But there are several critical distinctions that need to be drawn between what a system promises on paper, what controlled tests prove, and what real operational performance delivers under combat conditions with target saturation. Iranian Fateh Khaybar series missiles were combat tested in June 2025, under real, not simulated conditions, against real targets, with real countermeasures. The Allied Interceptor, on the other hand, has yet to begin its evaluations in 2026. It has no operational track record, no history of deployment in a real adversarial environment, and the saturation attack math complicates the equation in ways that no marginal improvement in interception performance can resolve. A single hypersonic launch against a point defense, under ideal conditions, with preparation time, may be interceptable by a perfectly functioning Arrow 4 system. But real attacks are not a single vehicle. They are multiple vectors, simultaneous, launched from multiple directions, some of which are decoys and others are live warheads. The cost per interception is radically asymmetric. An Iranian hypersonic missile costs a fraction of what it costs to produce and deploy an Arrow 4 interceptor. To saturate a point defense with multiple launches, the cost to the attacker is far lower than the interception cost to the defender. This asymmetry is not a flaw unique to the Arrow 4. It is a mathematical property of all point defense systems against saturation attacks. The attacker can scale the volume of attack more cheaply than the defender can scale interception capacity. The geometry of this confrontation is unfavorable to any pure defense system, and this is not catastrophism. It is straightforward systems analysis based on comparative costs and saturation rates. But here someone might object. We've been through this before. The world survived the compression of warning time when ICBMs replaced bombers. Why would now be any different? It's a fair objection. And the answer is specific, because the way the world survived the Cold War does not apply to the current problem. In the transition from strategic bombers to ICBMs, the world went from hours of warning to 30 minutes. That compression was traumatic for military planners and strategists of the era. 30 minutes was considered, in the internal debates of the 1950s and 1960s, virtually impossible to manage responsibly. The speed at which a Soviet ICBM could reach Washington seemed incompatible with any decision-making process that included verification, deliberation, and political authorization. The world built solutions. NORAD, as we mentioned earlier, was expanded as the North American Aerospace Defense Command, precisely to track these ballistic launches on a global scale and provide early warning. The famous red telephone between Moscow and Washington was implemented to prevent a misunderstanding from spiraling out of control. And the launch on warning doctrine became the new rule. With only 30 minutes and vulnerable weapons on the ground, the only way to maintain credibility was to guarantee retaliation before the enemy's impact. These solutions came with costs and generated their own dramatic risks. In September 1983, Stanislav Petrov was the Soviet lieutenant colonel on duty at the Early Warning Systems command bunker in Serpukhov 15, on the outskirts of Moscow. At 12:14 a.m., the Soviet Early Warning Satellite System reported the launch of an American intercontinental ballistic missile toward Soviet territory. Minutes later, the system reported 4 additional launches. The established protocol was clear: report to the chain of command, initiate the response chain. Petrov had minutes to decide. He decided it was a false alarm. His logic: the United States would not start a nuclear war with just 5 missiles. A first strike would involve hundreds, to ensure the destruction of Soviet second strike capabilities. 5 missiles made no sense as an initial preemptive attack. He classified it as a false alarm and did not report it. It was a false alarm. Sunlight reflected off clouds had fooled the Soviet satellite's infrared sensors. Petrov's decision not to report saved what could have been a catastrophe. But that decision was personal, intuitive, and contrary to established protocol. The system was designed to report. Had the duty officer on that specific night followed protocol, the Soviet response chain would have been activated. Now, the structural difference between the 30-minute compression and the 12-minute compression goes beyond a numerical difference. ICBMs were detectable from the moment of launch during the propulsion phase. A ballistic missile rises into the upper atmosphere following a predictable, mathematically calculable curved trajectory. Infrared satellites detect the intense heat of the rocket engine during the first minutes of flight, while the missile is still climbing. Long-range radars track the ballistic trajectory from the earliest moments, making it possible to extrapolate the point of impact with good precision. This means that with ICBMs, you have visibility of the attack from launch throughout the entire trajectory. The time compression is real. 30 minutes is little for everything that needs to happen, but the tracking is continuous and reliable. Hypersonics do not follow a ballistic trajectory. They glide within the atmosphere, below 100 kilometers in altitude, at altitudes and trajectories that specifically defeat the detection systems designed for ICBMs. Reliable detection occurs later in the trajectory, and if detection occurs later, the time window available for everything that needs to happen afterward is even smaller than the 12-minute window we started with. The solution the world built for the 30-minute problem, NORAD, hotlines, launch on warning, was designed specifically for the ICBM threat profile. It was not designed for the hypersonic threat profile, which has fundamentally different detection characteristics. To solve the 12-minute problem with hypersonics, the world would need a new solution, built from scratch for that threat profile. The Cold War solved the 30-minute problem. No one has solved the 12-minute problem. With 3 dominoes fallen, the shift in Israeli posture in June 2025, the Iranian authorization of October 2025, the Russian doctrine of 2024, what exists now is what analysts are calling an unstable triangle. 3 nuclear or proto-nuclear actors with positions that interact in ways none of the 3 fully controls. Israel is in the process of a complete reassessment of its nuclear posture following the June operation. What selective disclosure signals in operational practice is that Israel is replacing deterrence management through ambiguity, which worked for 50 years, with deterrence management through more explicit messaging, directed at specific actors, in specific contexts. This is a qualitative shift with consequences that ripple across the entire region. Ambiguity served a specific strategic function, preventing regional arms races, because other actors could not be certain enough that Israel possessed nuclear weapons to make it necessary to develop their own capabilities to balance against it. A more explicit posture, paradoxically, may create additional pressure on regional actors to develop or accelerate their own programs, because the threat is now clearer, and the logic of symmetric deterrence becomes more attractive. American strategic commitments intersect each vertex of the triangle differently, and these intersections create tensions that were manageable when the warning time architecture functioned, and are becoming increasingly difficult to manage when it does not. The US has a security commitment to Israel, including dimensions that touch on Israeli nuclear capability. It has a formal non-proliferation policy toward Iran, encompassing sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and the military action option. It has a strategic deterrence relationship with Russia that includes the nuclear arsenal balance that has existed since the Cold War. These 3 commitments were in equilibrium, tense but functional, when the warning time framework provided the stability upon which each relationship rested. The most promising technological bet against the 12-minute problem is precisely the Arrow 4. Rather than attempting to solve the offensive response equation within an impossible window, it aims to provide a defensive capability that downs delivery vehicles before impact. If the tests succeed, and there are technical reasons for caution about what successful in testing means under real saturation conditions, the timeline for Arrow 4 to represent an operationally deployed and tested response against the specific systems already in service is, by the most conservative estimate, several years after the initial 2026 tests. The Fateh K-Bar series missiles are deployed and have been combat tested. Russian hypersonic missiles in Belarus have been positioned since August 2025. The Yasin M Perm enters service in 2026 carrying the Tsirkon. Meanwhile, the Western Defensive Shield has barely begun testing. The Arrow 4 may well work when its trials begin. The problem is that the threats are already positioned in the field. And the central question this entire video has been building toward is this: can nuclear deterrence, the framework that has maintained peace between major powers since 1945, function reliably under 12-minute warning windows? Or does that specific number collapse the logical premises of deterrence before any decision can be made? Deterrence works when both sides believe that the second strike capability is credible and will survive the first strike. For that credibility to hold, the attacked side needs enough time to disperse or protect its response assets before the first blow lands, or to launch before that impact. To have that time, you need to detect the attack with sufficient advance notice. To detect with sufficient advance notice, you need more than 12 minutes of reliable detection window. If any link in that logical chain breaks, deterrence ceases to function the way it was designed to function, and the time compression that hypersonic systems create, combined with the later detection characteristics of those systems, makes that chain far harder to close than it was with ICBMs. 3 actors, 3 independent decisions, 1 destroyed framework. Israel decided in June 2025 that nuclear ambiguity was no longer a sustainable posture against the degree of threat the Iranian program represented, and conducted an operation that, while targeting Natanz, simultaneously signaled a fundamental shift in Israeli strategic posture. Iran interpreted the strikes as empirical confirmation that enrichment capability without a completed weapon offered insufficient deterrence against direct military action. And in October 2025, Khamenei formally authorized the development of miniaturized warheads, the line that had not been crossed before. Russia, already in 2024, had formalized the first nuclear threshold reduction by a recognized power since the Cold War, normalizing the idea that thresholds are adjustable and that hypersonics represent a qualitative threat category that justifies formal doctrinal responses. The title of this video speaks of a changed nuclear calculus, but that formulation is too gentle for what has actually happened. What happened is that the mathematical premises upon which nuclear deterrence theory was built and operated for 8 decades, premises about sufficient warning time, about reliable detection, about functional decision windows, have been rendered operationally invalid by systems that already exist, that have already been combat tested, and that are already deployed in the field. This is not a change in calculus. It is the destruction of the system of equations. What does not yet exist is a replacement framework. Arrow 4 is in testing, not deployed. There is no internationally agreed doctrine for managing deterrence under 12-minute windows. There is no modern NORAD equivalent built specifically for the hypersonic threat detection profile. There is no hotline between Tehran and Tel Aviv. No agreed verification protocol for this specific scenario. What to watch in the coming months? Arrow 4 test results throughout 2026 will be the most important indicator of whether a technically viable defensive response exists within a reasonable timeframe. IAEA reports on Natanz. Any recovered access will reveal the true state of the Iranian program after the bombings and the October authorization. And Russian doctrine and positioning movements, each new system deployment, each doctrinal adjustment, adds data to the framework that does not yet exist. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell if you want to keep following this subject, because the next chapters are already unfolding. Nuclear deterrence was the strangest peace architecture humanity ever built. It worked by keeping the mutual fear of destruction credible enough to prevent war between powers. It can continue to work, but not on the same terms, not with the same assumptions about warning time, not with the same margins that made Cold War solutions possible. 12 minutes changed everything, and no one yet knows what comes next.